welcome to another episode of Last Cast. You join us today at Hill Top Reservoir just outside Slough, which is on the outskirts of Huddersfield. It's a lovely venue and it's quite interesting. What we're doing today is we're going to employ a method that you've seen us employ on several other venues, including commercials and things like that, and we're looking at whip fishing again and how to attack these big venues using whips. In terms of the actual stock of fish here, it's mainly roach, a few perch and a few skimmers as well, but there's no sort of tension. It's very much your natural venue. The fish here are pretty much wild now. They were stocked probably 20 odd years ago, and they've just bred ever since, and there's some lovely stamp fish in here. So to that end, we're going to look to try and put together a weight of fish, mainly looking for quality roach, a few skimmers, maybe the odd perch, but there's quite a few small ones in here, so we'll try and avoid those as best we can. In terms of the rigs that I've got set up, I'm using two whips today. One thing that I will note is why I'm using whips instead of like traditional short line fishing with a pole is twofold really. First of all, there's quite a nasty side wind where we are today. It's halfway up the reservoir, and that's going to make pole fishing difficult and rig presentation. So using the rigs that we've got on the whips, it'll be able to cut through that wind a lot better than a pole would. But equally, there's a lot of pike in these venues. And say you're fishing 4 and 5 elastics and short rigs and things like that, when you're shipping back to a top kit, the pike will usually sit just off the end of your keep net and they'll nail every single fish that you have. By fishing whips and swinging fish out, I'm able to swing them from 3 up to 4 or 5 metres out from the bank to hand, so that avoids the problems of the pike. The fish will come straight up in the water and straight out. You won't be dragging them over the top, so that's why we've gone for whips today. So I'll run you through the rigs that I've got set up. The two whips, 3 and 5 metres, very similar rigs, just one more scaled up for the distance. The first rig I'm fishing on the 3 metre whip line, and I'm using a method that you'll have seen us use at the mill pond with a sliding float. That runs up on e41 Guru N gauge to a little float stop, and that's marked with the depth there. So I'm fishing just about dead depth. It's a sloping bank. Again, whip fishing that with this sliding float method, that'll swing into the bank quite nicely and sit against the bank. So we've got good presentation using a rig like this. So I've got the depth marked up there, but it's a rough guide within about a foot because of the sloping nature of the bank. Both whips I'm using a flick tip. Again, it's aiding the speed factor, and also so I can swing those roach out and avoid the pike. So that's e41 N gauge, and it runs down there to an olivette. I've got some trimming stots above it and some stiles beneath that. You'll see in quite a lot of my whip fishing rigs on these kind of big venues is I use stiles because I find that they're a lot better for avoiding tangles. They kick the line away from the olivette, as you can see, and it gives you like a leaded length of line, so again, good presentation. So I've got those there to weight that float down. The float itself is a 0.8 gram Dren & glow tip antenna, and then I've got a number 18 style there right above the hook length. That weighs 0.215 of a gram, so a heavy dropper. It's probably equivalent to 4 or 5 number 10s. And the reason that I use that is it's positive bite indication. Again, with a chop on the surface and plenty of fish, you need a positive dropper to register the bites. So I'll be able to see when the boat goes down, it'll settle to about there. And then when that dropper sits, it'll go to about there, and if the maggot's off bottom, it'll pimple it down that bit more. So again, it just allows me to read the bites. In terms of the hook, the hook length that we've got is 5 inches long because I want that last dropper close to the hook to register the bites. The hook length is 5 inches of 0.08 diameter line, so fairly strong, but again, we're targeting roach and things like that. You want something that's strong but equally presents a bait really nicely because they can be quite finicky. The hook choice is a Colmic Nuclear N957. Bit of an obscure pattern, but the key thing is with this hook, it's quite a heavy gauge, nice round bend, so it's going to have good purchase on the fish and allow me to swing them, but equally a long shank for unhooking. And it's a barbed pattern, but I've nipped the barb down, so when the roach are thrashing about, the hook won't simply drop out, but it's going to be quick enough to unhook. So that's the first rig. The second rig is very much the same, but as I say, on a 5 metre whip. And this one I'm looking to fish over a ground baited area for skimmers and bigger roach. So you can see moving up, we've got a fair bit of depth there, probably about 10 foot, something like that. Again, exactly the same wave marking, e41 N gauge, a glow tip antenna this time in a 1.25 gram. As I say, really nice floats for registering those lift bites off skimmers and things like that. The rig's exactly the same. Got a bulk there with an olivette, again stots rather than stiles on this because I've actually made an even bigger dropper there. I've brought a couple of stots down there, 2 number 9s above a number 18 style, so that's a very positive dropper there, about 0.3 of a gram. I may even bring more of those stots into play and really get that bait nailed to the bottom if there's plenty of skimmers there. The hook length and hook's exactly the same, N957s again. I may look to step that up to a 16, or I might even put on a B560 if I think there's a lot of skimmers in front of me. But that's actually, this rig's got that dropper just off bottom. I want to be able to drag the line on the bottom. Obviously the further you fish out from the bank, the worse the tow's going to be, so I need that bait to be static on the bottom. So those are the rigs looked at. In terms of bait, I'm keeping things very simple today. On the short line, I've got some red maggots, and that's what I'm going to look to feed for perch, roach, a mixed bag, and that's what I'm going to look to start my peg off with. But the main line is that 5 metre whip line, and that's with casters. I may employ some casters on that short line, say if I'm getting pestered by really tiny perch, but they're mainly as a feed bait to try and entice the bites. I want maggots on the hook ideally because they're a much more durable bait for when you're flicking that rig out quickly into a wind. Obviously with a whip, that bait's going to hit the water quite hard, so caster, you're never really sure if it's staying on. And then I've got ground bait, as I say. As you can see, that's absolutely loaded with casters, and I'm going to ball this in, feeding little nuggets about sort of that size, pretty much every fish over that 5 metre whip line. And the mix there's half brown crumb and half Census gross guard on. As you can see, it's quite a light mix, very bready, very rich. The reason why I've gone for a mix like that is there's a lot of fish in here, and especially this time of year they really want to feed, so a nice stodgy rich mix with plenty of bread content in it, get to the bottom nicely and really keep those fish grubbing around for bait. And obviously when I'm not feeding massive quantities of bait like on a pole, I want the bait to be rich, so obviously I'm creating a nice little area for those fish to feed over. So as I say, that's everything looked at there. The peg itself, I'm going to start on the 3 metre line, feed the 5 metre whip line, ball that in with about 3 or 4 balls of ground bait, then try and build the peg short, and then as the session progresses I'll look to go out to that 5 metre whip line and hopefully put a few skimmers together. So as I say, that's everything looked at, and we'll get into the session now. Right, so I'm now going to ball in the ground bait for this 5 metre line, as I've said. What I'm going to do with this rig is get it cast out. I've got my far bank mark, which is dead in front of me. I've got some houses opposite, and what I'm going to do is use the float as a marker. Obviously, compared to when you're pole fishing, you've got like your cupping kit or whatever to aim for, you don't have that option with the whip. So I've let the float settle. You can see it's starting to register now quite nicely. I'm just going to throw the balls of ground bait in. One thing you'll notice is the balls of ground bait are sort of odd shapes, and the reason is because there's a sloping bottom there. I want these to bed in behind sort of rocks and things like that. I don't want them to roll down the slope before they break up. So I'm going to ball a few shorter as well. Sort of do it in a bit of a line. And there you go, that's all 5 fed. So those will hopefully go somewhat to probably about 3/4 depth before they're really starting to break up. But the key thing is they're going to release the casters and they're going to fall to the bottom. So say this is, it's an attractant and a feed, but the main thing is getting those casters down there and creating a bed of ground bait. One thing I may even do, say I start catching a few skimmers, is introduce some sweet corn into this mix because it is very effective on this reservoir. So that's that line looked at, and now I'm going to kick off the session on the 3 metre line. One thing that's always important to do when you do ball any ground bait in, regardless of the style of fishing or you choose quantity of feed, is make note of the time. So I'm going to look to fish that line probably after half an hour, something like that, no longer than that, because I think that bait will be eaten by then. So as I say, we'll go for the first cast of the session now. I'll just quickly sort out my side trays. One note on that as well is what I do have is to my left hand side is all the bait that I'm going to feed by hand and by balling in. So my ground bait's there, my casters and my maggots there, and that's all going to get thrown in. The hook baits, I just keep a few maggots to my right hand side, because the reason is I put the maggots on the hook to my right hand side with my right hand, as you can see, like that. So it just speeds up the process. So that's it, we'll go for the first chuck of the session and start introducing some maggots. So this line I've got plumbed up around depth. Hopefully it shouldn't be long before we're into a few fish. Usually start with perch on this kind of venue, and then hopefully the roach will move in. There's the first fish already. I said small perch. You can see how quickly we'd add that bite and the fish is to hand. Just get the disgorger to pop that hook out. There you go, the first fish straight away. These rigs are lovely and sensitive for this style of fishing. With the glow tip antennas are just the perfect float for it. Nice bristle, which is just thick enough for visibility when you've got a bit of a chop on the surface, but equally plenty sensitive enough to register all these bites. So again, with this, just loose feeding those maggots in a nice sort of line in front of me. The key reason why I'm using the sliding float as well, there's another one, is to get that line beneath the surface when I've cast out. Obviously, on this venue, when you're sort of at halfway down a reservoir, there's going to be plenty of chop on the surface and a lot of undertow going the opposite way. And if you've got line on the surface, say with a standard pole float that you might be using, then that line's going to get caught by the wind and you're going to have your rig sort of going at an angle. Whereas with this sliding float, you've got the boat going straight down, the line's all sunk and it's all tight from the hook right through to the whip. Again, when you're fishing in this deeper water as well, it's essential that you have the hook and the line between that tight to the end of the whip so you can hit bites really quickly. And that's even more apparent when you're using that 5 metre whip, is that bulk's going way past your feed area, and as it's swinging in, all the lines remaining tight till that float registers. And obviously, as I say, when you're fishing against the slope as well, then the dropper will follow that down and swing against the slope, so you've got a perfect presentation. Having to wait slightly longer for this bite, I think I'll just change the maggot. One thing that is apparent on these venues, especially here at Hill Top, is the fish will not take a bust maggot. You have to have really fresh, perfect bait when you are fishing for these fish. On this line again, I'm looking probably to come up in the water. I've started about dead depth, and that's where I'm getting the perch, but I suspect if I was to fish, say, half depth, I'd get more roach, but the idea is just to build the peg. And as I say, if I start getting pestered by lots of those small perch later on in the session, then I'll just switch to caster, cut out the maggot completely. But as I say, looking to fish maggot on the hook, it's the feed bait which is going to dictate what kind of fish we're actually after. A little lift on the float there. Again, as soon as that float's going, I'm giving the whip a bit of a flick just to make sure that line's sinking immediately. So on this venue today, I could probably get away with using an 011 main line on the whip rigs, but I like to use 013 because then it gives me the option to step up to 012 on the hook lengths if I need to. Say I'm encountering some better perch or big skimmers, then I can step up to 012 fluorocarbon and like a B560 or something. So it's all about having flexibility. So it might take a little while to really get the fish going on this line. I've had a couple of perch quite quickly, but they do sort of move up and down this area of the reservoir. So you'll catch a few and the shoal will move. Some days, say if I was fishing at the windward end of the lake, it can be absolutely solid with fish, but as you get further up the reservoir, certainly in the middle stretches, it can be a bit iffy at times until you get the bait in and get the fish settled. But as you can see, that float there, you might be able to see it on the other camera shot, is staying absolutely stationary. I'm just going to take a little bit of depth off this time because I've not had a bite there. So I've always got my marker to go back to in terms of the depth. So I'm probably just going to move that 6 inches and try that. Because often you'll catch the better roach and things up in the water. But one thing I do have to be aware of is if I change the depth, obviously on a pull it's a bit different because you'll be able to judge how far out you're fishing. On a whip it's going to be fishing even further out, and obviously on a sloping bank, had a little bit of an indication there, that means that you're going to be even further off bottom. Say I've moved it 6 inches, I'm probably about more like 10 inches off bottom because of that extra distance out that I'm having to fish now. Again, just keeping that bait going in. As the session progresses, I'll have to look to work out how much I'm looking to feed each time. Maybe that at the start I'm feeding quite heavily, then I might cut it right down, or really just try and judge it as the session goes on. Obviously there are a lot of fish in these reservoirs, and it can be 50-50 sometimes whether you can catch more fishing with very little bait and feeding very little, or whether it's more effective to feed really vast quantities. Sometimes you might go through 4 or 5 kilos of ground bait and several pints of sample baits. But equally it can sometimes pay on these shorter lines to actually fish and feed less bait. One thing that you do have to be aware of as well, as I say, is the pike. It's very often, if you do get a shoal of feeding fish in front of you and it suddenly goes dead, very often there's a pike that's moved into the swim, which may be the case now. I've had those 2 perch and then I've not had a bite since. I've had a couple of little indications, but as I say, it may be the case that there's a pike there. They do like to sit on this sort of, that depth of water just off the end of your keep net. So sometimes what can pay off is actually casting slightly around your area of feed in this sort of scenario. Just going to see if those fish have moved a little bit away from the feed, see if they're shying away or whatever it might be. The key thing is this is just a starting line. I'm not trying to build the bulk of the weight today on this 3 metre line. I'm looking to catch the bulk of the fish on that 5 metre whip line. There's a perch. Right, so there's another fish now. Slightly better perch this stamp, but it's not been too hectic on that 3 metre line, unfortunately. I'm not exactly sure why. So what I've had to do with this rig, just to sort of try and entice a few bites, and it has worked, is I've actually sort of scaled it down a little bit. Nice little perch, that one. And I've taken a couple of the number 10 stocks off that were trimming shot, and I've moved the styles up towards the bulk, and I've put on 2 number 10 droppers and just set it fixed now, pretty much like a standard waggler, and that straight away produced a nice little perch. But in terms of time wise, it's been that half-hour mark now, so I know that if I keep feeding that line, hopefully a few fish will turn up. But I'm now going to pick up the 5 metre whip and just see if anything's settled over that ground bait. So the water is very clear today, so it might be that the fish are happy to settle at a greater distance out from the bank. So I'm just going to slip on a single red maggot and just flick this out. As you can see, with the rig like this, the bulk will go in and settle really quite quickly, especially with a bulk of about 1 gram as we've got on this rig, and straight away I've had a bite there and missed it. That was immediate, that, so there's clearly a few better fish out there. Obviously the fish also get quite a bit of time to look at the bait and see it as it's swinging in towards the bank, so that can help as well to get a few more bites. So that bulk settling now, and then the droppers will kick in. I think one's held it up. So definitely a few more bites on this line. Might be a case that I look to fish single or maybe even double maggot on this. I think single's good for a few bites, and double often can pick out the odd skimmer or better roach. I'm not going to feed just yet, but I'm just preparing 1 or 2 little balls of ground bait to throw as and when. Just had a bite then as well. So there's definitely a few fish down there. If the fish do start coming off bottom and I start missing a lot of bites, then I'll look to actually squeeze the balls of ground bait harder and maybe even dampen the mix more. But there's definitely a few more fish down there. I've had a bite each time I've gone in with this. I'm going to keep that 3 metre line fed. It's important that you, as always with your fishing, that you look to keep all your lines fed, even if you're not catching on them, because they may end up producing later on. Again, that 3 metre line somewhere that big perch and things like that are happy to crop up, so it's important that I do keep the bait going in there. There we go, just had a lift bite on this, and that's a roach. As you can see, in terms of where I've got the rig set, the fish is swung directly into my hand, but a nice positive lift on the float that time, again using a heavy dropper, and that's a lovely little roach to catch. So with any luck we'll be able to put a few more of them together. Definitely seems to me that the fish are happier to be further out from the bank. Yeah. So again, what I'm going to do is get into a bit of a rhythm with this. I'm going to try and catch a few fish without feeding. But if it turns out there's a lot of fish down there, then I'll really start to up the feed quite a lot. I want to get a good idea at the moment of what's down there. So again, I know the bulk settled, there's the dropper settling, and there's a bite straight away. Just missed that one. There's definitely a few fish down there. Look like a roach had sucked that. What I'm going to do now, because there's clearly a few better fish down there, is I'm going to step up to double maggot on this. But it's certainly looking like this will be the line that produces the most fish today. So again, feeding a couple of maggots on that 3 metre line. I'm just going to introduce a ball of ground bait now. Try and throw it a little bit better on that 5 metre whip. Again, I'm not too fussed about spreading the bait out a little bit because I'm expecting the fish to shoal up there. But certainly if you get a few skimmers as well, then there's no need to feed really in sort of a concentrated area. I think a fish has held that up there. There's definitely a lot more fish on that further out line. Yeah, it looks like a roach has nipped that a little bit. So again, all the while that float's settling, I'm just preparing the balls of ground bait that I'm going to feed on this line. It's a bit difficult in this crosswind to cast nice and accurately, but again, that's why I'm using quite a heavy float. If the wind was stronger, I wouldn't even hesitate to step up to a 2 gram glow tip antenna or something like that. Again, that's just settling down nicely. So with any luck, there'll be a few skimmers down there. With this rig I might have to play around with the depth and possibly put even more line on the bottom if this wind persists. It's actually got a little bit stronger since we started the session. But again, if I was fishing a pool in these conditions, it'd be very difficult to control it. Once I've got that float out there, then when the olivette's sinking and getting all the line nice and tight, then it's very easy to keep control of the rig. And obviously with a slimmer blank on the whip, it'll cut through that wind a little bit better and just generally make the fishing a lot easier. Certainly expecting a few more bites today than we've had. It's starting to be a bit more difficult than I thought it would be. Say in other areas of the reservoir, sometimes they produce more than others on certain days. The fish obviously here like to move around in big shoals. So you've got to be aware that sometimes in the session it might take an hour or so for them to turn up in your peg, which is why you need to make sure that you keep that bait going all the time. Missed a bite there. Going to take 1 or 2 of the trimming shot off just to make sure I can see that float above the chop, because it is picking up now a little bit more. All I use on this this rig is just little number 13s to trim the float down and get it pimpled to the correct amount of bristle. So I've not fed that ball of ground bait just yet because I'm still waiting for another bite. because often, especially when you get really strong winds on these reservoirs, it can push the fish down to one end or the other. Obviously today we're in the middle, and it seemed to be ideal at the start before the wind really picked up, but again, on these big expanses of water, it's just something that you've got to try and negotiate a little bit. I thought we'd be into fish a lot quicker though, considering how quickly I was getting those first few bites, and then they seemed to have shied off. I think there's not really a great quantity of fish in front of me today on this peg. Just missed a bite there. They are being very finicky as well. So I'm just going to feed this ball a ground bit. Just see if that gains a response. As soon as I've fed one ball of ground bait, then I'll get another prepared, just ready to feed. Get a few maggots on that 3 metre line, because this might be one of those sessions where we really have to work hard for the fish. So again, making sure I keep putting a fresh bait on each time. As I say, I think I'll just have to keep working between the two lines at the moment to work out where the fish are happiest to settle, where I can pick a few off. Because it may be that I just have to catch them in little pockets rather than really work to build a weight by catching constantly. There we go. There's a better fish. Nicer perch this time, not going to swing in. It's often a sign though, when there's lots of perch in front of you, hooks just dropped out in the net, that the roach really haven't settled, but again, you can build a weight of these fish quite quickly. Again, nice positive bite on that. Funnily enough, when I've dropped him with the maggot, another perch has taken it. How about that? There's clearly a few perch really short as well. I'm saying if I was looking to catch lots of those, then I'd have to pick up a 2 metre whip and fish really close in, but again, nice little fish that one. So it wasn't exactly intentional, but shows that there's still quite a few in front of me. So that might be something to think about, that possibly by deepening off and coming a bit further up that shelf on the 3 metre line, I might be able to pick up a few more fish there. But I certainly think that the fish haven't fully settled yet on either of the lines, so I'm going to keep the feed going in, and hopefully we can get a good spell of catching going at some point. For the moment, it looks like each of the lines is going to require a bit more priming before that actually happens. A little indication there as well. As I say, we'll crack on and hopefully we can get the fish lined up on 1 or 2 of the lines and really try and put a weight together. It's a perch this time. Interesting, that was just to the left hand side of the feed that time. Nice little roach. There's something a bit more substantial. It's a nice roach, that one. And we met this one. Not worth swinging. It's probably the biggest roach of the session, that. There's one. Another roach there. Interestingly, I've just fed a ball of ground bait and had 2 bites straight away, so I do think that these fish now might respond to a little bit more feed. It might be something that I start looking into doing, is feeding every 2 or 3 fish now, just to see if that can sort of force the peg a little bit more and encourage a few more bites. So you can see the wind's gusting a little bit, so I'm just going to wait till I can make a good cast. I'm just going to make up a ball of ground bait. While that float's settling, I'm just going to, till it's fully reached depth, then I know the exact distance, bite straight away, and I'm going to feed again. Another roach. So with any luck, if this persists and I can really start to put a few fish together, then we might be on for a slightly better weight than I thought we might be. But again, another little adjustment I've made is just move that dropper up. Obviously I've taken those number 9s up to the bulk now and moved the dropper up about 1 inch, and again, seems to have made a difference now. I've had 2 fish in 2 chucks. So I think possibly a more negative rig, but feeding a little bit more heavily might actually be the way to go today. So every time that float's settling, I'm just making up a ball of ground bait. Because then when you do get into a good rhythm like this, then you can really start to put a good weight together. So I'm not sure whether that'll happen today, but that's the entire idea of whip fishing in this style, is so you can get a good rhythm together between feeding and landing fish. And that's when you can really put a weight together and outscore people fishing the pull and the waggler. And the float's not gone this time just yet, but hopefully a few feeding roach will attract more roach, and you never know, they might start to line up even more. Seems, as I say, we've had them in pockets today of 2 or 3 fish, and then it's gone a bit quiet. So I'm just going to feed another ball of ground bait. Again, making sure that I am feeding those balls just slightly short of the float. But as I said earlier, I'm trying to be a lot more accurate now. Just a little bite then. And each time I come back in, putting that fresh maggot on. But still casting around the feed area just a little bit to see if I can pick off 1 or 2 better fish. Again, that float's settling nicely now. Obviously with this stronger wind, there's another fish on, just come off that time. Did have a little bit of a snag up on the bottom again, so I might have to change that hook. It might be slightly blunt. Yeah, it's not too bad, but if I lose another fish, then I'll definitely have to look to put a fresh hook on. It is the risk that you run when you're fishing on a slope like this that is quite rocky. When you are bringing that rig out, the hook can bounce off and whack onto different bits of rock and debris on the bottom, and that can blunt the hook. And obviously when you're fishing like this, it's important that you do have a sharp hook on every time. Because if I lose another fish, then I will have to change that hook. Again, a little bit of an indication there as that float was settling. Again, the useful thing with these floats is the fact they do have those 2 yellow bands beneath the orange tip, and you can just read little hold-ups and dips on the float very easily. obviously when you're fishing for roach and fish like that can bust the maggot, it's absolutely invaluable then, because you can see that those fish have plucked at the bait as it's been going down. Then you know that you need to bring that back in and change the hook bait over. Getting 1 or 2 more bites now as well, but as I say, I'm just having to suss out which way the peg's going now, whether feeding aggressively is going to be the way to go, or whether changing the rig and trying to apply a bit more finesse. It's just one of those today. It's going to be an interesting session anyway. I don't think we're on for a massive weight, but it'll be certainly a session that we can learn a little bit more about the reservoir from. So in past sessions, I know that it does pay a lot to change the depth and things like that in terms of how you're presenting the bait here. But I've done something slightly different today and fished a lot more aggressively than I usually would with the whip. And it has worked to an extent, but then the fish have backed off. So again, it's all about learning when you go fishing in places like this. Because especially on these big natural venues, they can fish completely differently from day to day. So you just don't know where the fish are going to be and what kind of method's going to be the best to catch them. So I don't think the whip's been as good as it could be today. Again, just a slightly quieter spell there. But it's always worth trying different things, different times of year, just to see what actually produces. I don't think on large venues like this they're ever going to be 100% consistent, but as I say, it's good because it does keep you on your toes with your fishing. Yeah, these are starting to come a bit thick and fast now. The session's really picked up since I've done a bit of a refeed. I've put in another 8 balls of ground bait, so heavier than the initial feed. As I said, the peg went a bit dead for a while, and what I've done is I've put in 8 balls of ground bait, and I've been topping up after every sort of 5 or 6 fish with another little nugget, and it seems to have really picked up the fishing now. I think earlier the amount of fish in the peg wasn't quite enough in terms of when I was feeding small amounts of bait, and whatever pike were down there were probably spooking them. Whereas now, since I've put in plenty of bait, it's attracted a large shoal of fish, and I think they just feel safer in numbers down there. And that's why I'm starting to put together a few nice roach now. The perch seem to have moved out of the peg and the roach seem to have settled now, so hopefully we'll get a few decent ones and possibly even the odd skimmer if we're lucky. There's another fish on now. Bit smaller that one, but again, lovely little fish. So hopefully at this rate we can start to put a bit more of a weight together. I think with the conditions suddenly becoming more overcast as well, that's definitely helped the fishing. But I'm not having to wait half as long for bites as I was earlier in the session. So all I've been doing is topping up after every few fish with a little nugget like that, just a few casters in it, right behind the float, and that seems to have really drawn the fish in quite well. Obviously the initial bombardment's what's brought in a bigger shoal of fish, and just by keeping little balls of ground bait like that going in, it's keeping the shoal occupied, and I'm able to catch fish at decent intervals now. So as I say, hopefully we'll be able to put a bit of a better weight together at this rate. Just missed a bite then. So I say we'll carry on with this, and hopefully this sort of regime that I've got going at the moment might mean that we can put a better weight together by the end of the session. Right, we're getting into a good steady stream of these roach now, and we've managed to put a good few fish together, but as I say, the session's drawing on now quite a bit, so I think we'll probably have another couple of chucks and look at concluding the session. It's been interesting today in terms of the feeding. We had a very slow, difficult start, but as the session's sort of worn on a little bit, made a few little changes, and eventually the 5 metre whip line has come good after sort of pretty much throwing it caution to the wind and really aggressively feeding the peg with 8 or 9 big balls of ground bait, and then feeding really heavily constantly as well. That's really sparked the fish into feeding. I think at the start of the session we had issues probably with pike, and the early fish that were in the peg were probably getting spooked, but I think as the session's gone on and we've got a bit more bait in the peg, and then really giving it a boost with, as I say, a good 8 or 9 balls of ground bait, the roach have really come in the numbers and settled. And I think obviously when that happens, you can really put together a weight, but also the pike don't have as easy of a time of attacking the shoal as well. So I certainly think that's made a big difference to how we've been catching today. As I say, I think we'll probably just have 1 or 2 more fish if we're lucky, and then we'll probably call it a day at that, and hopefully see what we've caught. There's another one now. I think, as I say, we'll probably call this one the last of the session. Another lovely little roach. Just dropped off there onto the side tray, but another lovely little fish. And as I say, we'll call that the last one of the day, and we'll have a look at what we've caught. Right, so that concludes our session here at Hill Top Reservoir today. We've had a fantastic day. It's had a slow start, but it's suddenly got a lot better towards the end when we've reballed in and really sort of aggressively attacked the peg, and the fish have definitely responded today. As you can see, it looks like a completely different water now to when we started in terms of the conditions. It's almost flat calm. So as I say, we'll have a look at what's in the keep net now. So as you can see there, we've got a nice net of roach. Definitely probably 4 or 5, maybe 6 pounds worth of fish there, but plenty of fish and a great day's sport. There's a few perch in there mixed in as well, and 2 hybrids. As I say, we've not encountered any skimmers today, but again, it's just the way it goes sometimes. But that's a cracking net of fish from a natural venue. As you can see there, plenty of bites, and only really gone through a couple of bags of ground bait and best part of a pint of casters, and that's been pretty much it. So we'll get these returned now. You can see a fantastic net of fish there and a great day's sport. Key thing is with these venues is you've got to try and suss them out on the day. From one day it can change from being absolutely solid with fish in one peg to having next to no fish, and as today we've had to really work at the peg and try and get the fish in and feeding confidently, which has taken a couple of hours, but eventually, as you can see there, we've managed to put together a nice net of fish. We try to put as many videos as we can together for you viewers from these natural venues and different kinds of venues as well, compared to the commercials that you often see. So some days you'll see us will catch a good net of fish like that, and other days, as the session looked like it was going to be when we started, you'll see us struggle a bit. But again, something different, and obviously it can certainly help you in other areas of your fishing to learn different methods like this. But as I say, we've had a great day's sport here at Hill Top Reservoir today, so we'll conclude the session at that. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on that next episode.